From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Supreme Court justices show skepticism over Donald Trump's arguments for broad presidential immunity, even as Trump sits for day 3 of witness testimony in his criminal trial in New York. Former federal prosecutor Jessica Roth will help us break it down.
Economic data today show an economy slowing more than expected as prices rise more than forecast, raising doubts over interest rate cuts this year and presenting new concerns for the White House.
And Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in China raising concerns over unfair trade practices ahead of a potential meeting with President Xi. We'll be talking later with Illinois Congressman Krishnamoorthi, ranking member of the House China Select Committee. Kaylee, we're balancing a couple of big stories today. One of them was the economy, certainly the economic data that sent Wall Street on a bit of a spiral today. But we had our eyes on 2 different courts, including the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court, hearing arguments today in this presidential immunity claim by Donald Trump that will impact more than just Donald Trump. This is helping to reshape, essentially, or give us a fresh look at the presidency overall.
Sure. It definitely it has implications for his case brought here in Washington by Jack Smith, the question of whether or not it will go to trial before the election. But as Joe says, this is much bigger than just one former president. It could have implications for future presidents to come. That was a concern expressed by Justice Brett Kavanaugh during arguments today.
It's not going to stop. It's going to cycle back and be used against the current president or the next president and the next president and the next president after that.
Helping us understand the arguments as we read the tea leaves, Bloomberg's Greg Storr, who covers the Supreme Court for Bloomberg. And Greg, I know you were glued to this as we all were today, trying to understand the trend here to get a sense of what we might be getting in terms of a ruling, because the Chief Justice called out the appeals court ruling, criticized it, the very ruling that brought us here to this point, even as we heard other justices sympathizing with Donald Trump. How do you put this all together?
Yeah, well, the Chief Justice did. He basically went to what he said was the core of the appeals court's reasoning, and he suggested there's not enough there. Yeah. And he raised the possibility of sending the case back to the appeals court to look more closely at the particular allegations against Donald Trump and trying to figure out which of them involve official acts and might be where you might have immunity for those, and which involve purely private acts, in which case a trial could go forward on those charges. Mm-hmm.
So it comes down to a question of if it were sent to the appeals back down to the lower court, how quickly they would make that decision, knowing that they don't technically have to decide until the end of the term, which is at the end of June, and then therefore how quickly that decision could be made. Just walk us through potentially the lengths of the timeline we're talking about here, knowing we're facing that November election.
Yeah, so if it were a normal case, this is the last argument of the term. Last argument of the term, I would say, yeah, it's probably not going to get decided until pretty, far into June, just because of the nature of things. They have a lot of decisions to deal with. Add to that this is a very weighty case, especially complicated, and I would say almost certainly the end of June. The only reason why they might rule sooner would be if they want to sort of push this process along so there can be a trial this year. I didn't hear anything in the courtroom today that suggested there was a lot of concern about that issue from particularly the conservative justices. So I'm not going to be holding my breath until we get close to the end of June, and that's going to make it very, very hard to have a trial this year.
Just to make sure our viewers and listeners understand the menu of options here, you suggested it could be sent back to the appeals court. What else could the court do?
Well, it could. I mean, in theory, it could agree with Donald Trump and say the indictment should be dismissed. No indication that's going to happen. Yeah. What Jack Smith's office has been hoping for is that the court would agree with the D.C. Circuit very quickly, and that would mean the trial could go ahead. Mm-hmm. It also didn't sound like that was going to happen today. It sounded like there was enough skepticism of the appeals court decision, enough justices who were concerned, like Justice Kavanaugh, that you might be sweeping in future presidents who might face criminal liability for doing things within their job description. And the court seems like it is going to at least say, hey, go back and take a closer look at it. And again, that probably means the trial's not happening before the election.
Wow.
And we've all been focused on the fact that it's the Washington trial that Jack Smith brought, but he also brought charges against Donald Trump in the documents case down in Florida. This has implications for that, too.
It does. Donald Trump is also arguing in that case it involved his official acts, and he should be immune there. It's a different sort of argument because, much of the allegations there happened while he was out of office, after he had become a private citizen again. So it's probably a weaker argument for him in that case, but he's trying to make it, and certainly could affect it. Very much could affect the Georgia case. And in fact, in the Georgia case, prosecutors may have an even harder time because it's not the federal government, it's the state government pressing those charges.
Yeah, but an important distinction is Donald Trump also couldn't pardon himself in the Georgia case because it's a state case, unlike these federal cases, should he become president again. Bloomberg's Greg Storr has had a long day covering these arguments. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, it's worth pointing out that President Trump was not at the arguments at the Supreme Court today because he was in court in New York, meaning he was unable to officially campaign but still address the cameras and weighed in on his chances in the Empire State.
We're going to run very hard in New York. New York, we have a good chance of winning New York, in my opinion. I think we're going to do very well, and we're going to make a play for New York.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Laura Davison, one of our politics editors. So, Laura, we know that New York is a pretty solidly blue state. It's also a state that Donald Trump doesn't have much love for, if you listen to his words, especially given that he is facing a criminal trial in the state. But once again, seeing the opportunity while he is not on the campaign trail, we heard from him multiple times today on the way in and on the way out. So to what extent is this actually impacting his 2024 bid?
He's able to get in front of cameras, multiple times a day, as you mentioned. We've seen him do now twice these little stops where he just, stops, on a, it was Harlem last week, this week, Midtown. And when you're in New York, you're within a couple miles of basically every major news network in the country. So instead of going to, rural Pennsylvania or rural Georgia, you can be in New York and get headlines, even if you're not necessarily interacting with voters. And that's been Donald Trump's campaign style anyways. He doesn't do a lot of retail politicking, shaking hands. He has these big rallies when he goes out places. Ironically, it's in New York where he's doing more of that, shaking hands. Today it was construction workers signing MAGA hats. And so this is able to, get him in front of a different audience and build a little bit of a different persona, and only taking, 30 minutes of his time.
Yeah. Did he say New York's going to be in play? Is that what he suggested? Yes. That would be absurd. Really, for bright blue New York, right?
It is unlikely that he will be able to win New York. He lost it by 20 percentage points in 2020 to Joe Biden. There was a poll this week from the New York Times and Siena College that showed that was a 10 percentage point gap between Biden and Trump, with Biden in the lead. We'll see. Trump has talked about this for a long time, but this is not something that you should hold your breath for. That any major electoral college watchers are.
Well, I don't know.
Planning.
Joe Biden says he's got Florida in play. Donald Trump's looking at New York. I guess anything could happen.
Well, we certainly know that to be true, Joe. You can never rule anything out. But speaking of Joe Biden, worth pointing out, he also was in New York State today. At first, he was up near Syracuse talking about money being spent for the CHIPS Act, and he's going to be holding a campaign event raising money in New York as well. They're not going to be too far from each other, but it does just show the contrast of the reasons why they are in New York. Biden is doing so with freedom. Trump is doing it because he has to be there.
Yes, and this is really, kind of who you see, where you see them going and who they're talking to also really speaks to their priorities of, Trump was with construction workers talking about Joe Biden's, quote, failed economic policies. Yeah. Joe Biden is up in Syracuse talking about this new semiconductor investments, CHIPS money, talking about how he views his policies as succeeding. So this is, and then he's got a fundraiser this evening with some Hollywood movie stars in Westchester at a very nice event. So
So interesting you point out, though, that stop on the road today for Donald Trump was important when he was talking to those construction workers, some of them wearing red MAGA hats. They all had their phones up in the air. It was a celebrity sighting. They were chanting, "We love Trump." Those are moments that he can continue to reproduce even as this case continues, isn't it?
Yes, we anticipate that we'll see, these, throughout the next, 6 or so weeks of this trial, that he'll continue to do this. These are also ways that his team kind of personally is able to build up Trump. Court has been very draining on him. Going and sort of interacting with the crowds is a way that he kind of, builds his sense of self.
He says it's very cold in there. Are they keeping it too cold for him on purpose?
That's also been the report. Either been too cold or too hot. I think it's, this courtroom is sort of like your high school, and that that the temperature control is never right.
TV studio, in my personal experience.
I'm sure I have nothing to do with that. Bloomberg's Laura Davison, thank you. It is pretty nice in here at the moment. Coming up, we'll be joined by the ranking member of the House Select Committee on China, Krishnamoorthi, the Democrat from Illinois. It's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We have an obligation for our people and indeed an obligation for the world to manage the relationship between our two countries responsibly. That is the obligation that we have and one that we take very seriously. And I think the direction from President Biden and President Xi was to continue to build those lines of communication, to sustain them, and again, to deal directly with our differences as we also seek to build cooperation.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken on how he thinks the U.S. should navigate the complex relationship with China, and in some cases using those lines of communication to send a difficult message. Joining us now is the ranking member of the House Select Committee on China, Illinois Democratic Congressman Krishnamoorthi. It's great to see you, Congressman. Welcome back to Bloomberg. I wonder your thoughts as Antony Blinken makes this most recent trip to China, talking about cracking down on unfair trade practices and even potentially levying sanctions against China for its trade relationship with Russia that has been impacting the war in Ukraine. Is this sort of double talk in the way that you see it? We're trying to engage new lines of communication, but we don't have a lot of good things to say to Beijing, do we?
Actually, I think it's very constructive for Secretary Blinken to kind of lay out our concerns and talk about the consequences of not dealing with those concerns. My hope is that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, knowing how weak their economy is right now and knowing the need to constructively engage with the rest of the world, including the United States, would change course and avoid the economic aggression and military aggression that has marked some of its past behavior. That's my hope. But we have to prepare for the opposite. And that means telling them, look, if you continue to engage in military aggression or assisting others, this is the consequence, sanctions. Or if you dump products such as electric vehicles, for instance, on other markets, you're going to face higher tariffs. And so being very explicit is not a bad thing.
Well, Congressman, explicit in something, sure, like the idea that the administration is not trying to pursue a decoupling from the Chinese economy. But how difficult is it to square? We don't want to decouple, but we will put in place export controls so that you can't develop certain sectors of technology. We will try to force a Chinese-owned company to divest its U.S. arm in TikTok, whether or not China would really like to go along with it. Is that not sending conflicting signals, sir?
No, I think the through line here, Kayleigh, is in those spheres where the CCP is going to practice what I call technological aggression or economic aggression or military aggression, we are going to protect our interests and protect ourselves. But in those places where there's constructive engagement, or they, better yet, reduce their aggression, then we will engage and we will not adopt countermeasures that we might otherwise adopt. So I think that is really the theme here, which is if you practice aggression, we will take steps to counter them. But if you don't, or if you reduce that aggression, then I think the rest of the world will engage with you.
Well, we're further complicating matters with this new piece of legislation that you helped to get through Congress and the president just signed that calls for a divestiture or outright ban of TikTok. And the CEO of TikTok had this to say about the legislation that would force ByteDance to go through with this deal. Let's listen to what he said, and we'll have you respond.
Make no mistake, this is a ban on TikTok and a ban on you and your voice. We are confident and we will keep fighting for your rights in the courts. The facts and the Constitution are on our side, and we expect to prevail again.
They're about to unleash a lot of money on lawyers here, Congressman. As he just said, we'll see you in court. And we know that they unleashed an enormous amount of money and a lot of effort in a lobbying campaign against this bill. They actually had it shut down for a while. Now that it's law, what happens next?
Well, first of all, you saw the results of their millions and millions of dollars of lobbying and advertisements, which was it backfired. They lost complete credibility on Capitol Hill. That very CEO that you just featured a moment ago made misrepresentation after misrepresentation with regard to TikTok, its relationship to ByteDance and the CCP. And as a consequence, no one really believed anything that he said. And that's why you had 360 votes in favor of our package and this piece of legislation. I think going forward, I think they're going to continue with their description of this as being somehow a ban when it's really not. It's regulation. It's akin to calling a speed limit a driving ban. No, it's the condition under which a company is allowed to operate in the United States. And here the condition is you can't be owned or controlled by a foreign adversary. And as you know, there are foreign ownership limits that apply to radio stations, newspapers, TV stations. And we are just merely applying that principle and updating it for the 21st century to social media. I don't know how ByteDance is going to proceed. I hope that they are constructive and that they use this time to sell TikTok, monetize their investment, and allow the platform to continue operating under new management.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Congressman, what should other Chinese companies or just foreign adversary-owned companies be thinking while ByteDance is doing this work? I'm thinking of Temu, for example, or others. Could you see similar concerns with those kind of applications in the U.S. that could be subject to something similar? I just wonder what future platforms should be thinking when they see what Congress has just done.
Well, remember, this particular law applies to social media platforms, not so much e-commerce sites like Temu or some other, like Alibaba or something like that. This applies to social media sites. So the president will have the authority to investigate and make a determination with regard to any other social media sites that might be similar in nature or kind to TikTok. That's up to the executive branch. But in this particular case, Congress has made a determination with regard to ByteDance.
But like WeChat, for example, run by Tencent, that could be applicable.
WeChat could be, but there's no indication that this is something that rises even close to the level of ByteDance's relationship with TikTok. And certainly it's not as nearly influential or pervasive as TikTok.
Seems like we can cut to the chase here, Congressman, because this would also require approval from Beijing, correct? For ByteDance to spin off TikTok. I think we can all admit that's not going to happen. So can you tell our viewers and listeners to prepare for a TikTok ban?
No, I think that this is something that Xi Jinping is thinking about right now. The reason I say that is because he brought it up in the phone call with President Biden last week. So it is up to the paramount leader, Xi Jinping. That's how high up the echelon this particular decision is going to be made. And that also illustrates the connection between the CCP and this platform. Now, as to how he's going to decide, I don't know. But the Chinese economy is absolutely tanking right now. He's actively courting foreign investment to shore it up. So the question for him is, does he send the message to foreign investors that he's trying to court that he has the potential to zero out their investments and basically deny them the ability to monetize their success and investments in China? Or does he allow ByteDance to sell TikTok? I hope that he makes the right move.
Congressman, we just have a minute left with you, but do you also expect we could see a retaliatory move from Xi Jinping and the CCP? And if so, what kind of companies would they go after?
Oh, they've already gone after our companies, Kayleigh. None of our social media companies are allowed to operate in China. And that's, after all, another reason why we are very concerned about this arrangement where there's no reciprocity. They want to be able to operate here freely, unfettered, but they don't allow our companies to do the same in China.
All right, Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi of Illinois, the ranking member of the House China Select Committee. Thank you so much for joining us here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. We want to turn now to Anna Wong, Bloomberg Economics chief U.S. economist, as we consider here in Washington what was the kind of economic data you might not want to see if you are sitting in the White House. Anna, today we got the first quarter GDP print lower than every single estimate at 1.6%. We were looking for 2.5%, and price pressures looked pretty sticky. Perhaps that is what is most concerning. With the data we have seen, what should we think about the Federal Reserve and what it's likely to do with the remainder of this year?
Yeah, so after today's GDP report, there were a lot of utterance of stagflation. But if you look at the details of the GDP, in fact, it's the volatile categories that's pushing GDP down. At the underlying it, it's actually pretty strong, decent GDP growth. And that is the reason why inflation surprised on the upside. But still, I think from the White House perspective, you certainly do not want to see inflation being so hot, and it is pretty hot. It's looking to be pretty hot tomorrow.
So this does not meet the definition of stagflation, but the reaction today on Wall Street was pronounced. Obviously, there's concern here in Washington about whether the Fed might do anything the course of this year.
The really sharp reaction in Wall Street is driven by the idea that the GDP print today implies that the core PCE inflation we're getting tomorrow will show 0.48 monthly increase in March, which is higher than anybody thought. But I think in actuality, what we're getting tomorrow is 0.29, which is hot, uncomfortably hot, but it's not as hot as what Wall Street was reacting to today based on the GDP numbers.
Just, we have a minute left, Anna, but quickly, are we going to find out that it was too easy to call soft landing when all is said and done?
Definitely. I think all said and done, the path for soft landing is super, super narrow. It's really either no landing or just a delayed hard landing. Yeah.
Fascinating stuff. That's not what the White House wants to hear.
No.
Kayleigh, to your point, we've been talking about soft landing, and the trajectory was in Joe Biden's favor. I think we can agree for some time. We just haven't seen it connect in the polls. This probably won't help. Remember Anna's analysis when the PCE data come out tomorrow. Anna Wong, Bloomberg Economics chief U.S. economist. We thank you, as always. Coming up, the Supreme Court wrapping up oral arguments in a case that could shape the November election and future presidencies. We're live on the ground in front of the court. Coming up next, we'll look into the legal arguments as well with former federal prosecutor Jessica Roth. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We have a big case today. This judge isn't allowing me to go. We have a big case today in the Supreme Court on presidential immunity. A president has to have immunity. If you don't have immunity, you just have a ceremonial president.
Former President Trump speaking with reporters earlier. He was in New York today, even as Supreme Court justices heard arguments here in Washington in Donald Trump's bid for presidential immunity. A significant day for his legal journey. And Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall joins us now with more from the Supreme Court. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe. The Supreme Court appeared skeptical today of former President Trump's claim to absolute immunity from criminal prosecution related to actions he took while in office. This all stems back to special counsel Jack Smith's election interference case against him over allegations the former president interfered in the 2020 election, charges that former President Trump denies. Now, this case cannot move forward until the question of immunity is decided, and that might take longer than expected. That's because a key justice today indicated that the high court might send this right back down to the lower court, further delaying proceedings. I want you to take a listen to what Chief Justice John Roberts had to say about the issue earlier.
The Court of Appeals below, whose decision we're reviewing, said, quote, a former president can be prosecuted for his official acts because the fact of the prosecution means that the former president has allegedly acted in defiance of the laws. That, I think, is the clearest statement of the court's holding, which is why it concerns me.
A key question in this case is whether former President Trump's actions in question were made in a private or official capacity. His legal team argues that commander-in-chief can't have the threat of criminal prosecution hanging over them to do their job effectively. Some key conservative justices like Brett Kavanaugh signaled concern about what this could mean for future presidents. However, the 3 liberal justices signaled sympathy with Jack Smith's argument that no one is above the law.
I'm trying to understand what the disincentive is from turning the Oval Office into, the seat of criminal activity in this country.
Now, the Supreme Court could wait until the end of the term to decide what to do. That would bring us to about late June. We know that the judge in this federal election interference case has said that both sides will have about 3 months to prepare before going to trial. Joe and Kaylee, when you do the math, that could mean a potential trial up until starting in September, barring how this immunity case shakes out and any other further delays.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall outside the Supreme Court for us tonight. Thank you so much. Now, we spoke about this question of presidential immunity with the president of the Constitutional Accountability Center, Elizabeth Wydra, earlier today. And this is what she had to say about how the Constitution might view this.
There's some times where history is ambiguous. This is not one of those cases. They sold the Constitution to the people in part because this president would not be a king, and in part because he could be potentially criminally liable if he committed crimes, which is a major change from the British system. So if you're an originalist, if you're a strict constitutionalist, there's really only one outcome here.
For more on this, we're joined now by Jessica Roth. She's a former federal prosecutor for the Southern District of New York and a law professor at Cardozo School of Law. Professor Roth, always great to have you here on Bloomberg Television and radio. Elizabeth seemed to think this was pretty cut and dry, but it's really not clear that the Supreme Court justices today thought the same. What did you make of the questions they asked, the answers they received in return, and how likely they ultimately are to make a decision on this that favors Donald Trump?
Well, I was struck by how there didn't seem to be a clear path toward a majority on any one way to resolve this case. We heard a lot of concern about the consequences of ruling that a president can be criminally prosecuted for official acts taken while in office. That was articulated in particular by Justices Alito and Gorsuch. Wouldn't this have a chilling effect on a president who would be chilled while in office and who would be susceptible to prosecution by political enemies when he left office? What would be the consequence of a ruling that a president could be prosecuted, right, from that point of view? And then you had the other concern that a contrary ruling holding that a president could not be prosecuted for official acts, right? What would that say in terms of creating the possibility that somebody would be absolutely above the law, even once they left the office of the presidency, and could just essentially commit acts without any consequence that were criminal, using the highest office in the land, the most powerful office in the world, to commit crimes. So you had those two competing concerns, and which of those is a greater concern for the majority of the court may frame how it comes out in this case.
Well, I'm confused, Jessica, and I know that happens a lot, but when you look at the history here, in 2020, it's not that long ago, the court unanimously rejected Donald Trump's claims of absolute immunity. So what's changed?
Well, what they rejected in the case involving Cy Vance, then the district attorney in New York County, his claim of absolute immunity from producing documents in response to a subpoena. And they said that that subpoena could go forward. It had to be narrowly tailored, et cetera. Here they're talking about, and it related to acts before he was in office, when he was a private citizen. Here, the indictment alleges some acts that can be articulated as official acts, such as communications with Department of Justice employees, communications with state office holders, but then many other acts that are best characterized, and even Trump's attorney agreed they could be characterized as private acts, not official acts. And so it's the fact that some of the conduct in the indictment can be characterized as official acts is part of what takes this out of the realm of the prior decision involving immunity for subpoena for documents relating to private conduct.
Okay, so Jessica, we know that obviously this has major implications for the Jack Smith case brought here in Washington. It also could have implications for the documents case in Florida, the other federal case in which Donald Trump has been charged, although he was out of office, to your point on the distinction, by the time most of that alleged conduct happened. What about other election interference cases, like the state case in Georgia, for example? If there's something in this federal case that the Supreme Court ultimately decides he does have protection for, would that affect Fani Willis's case? Could it affect other cases in which he's an unindicted co-conspirator, as we've seen with Michigan and Arizona in the last 24 hours?
So if the court holds that he has immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts, and there's so much overlap between the arguably official acts in the Jack Smith case and the Atlanta case in Georgia, that I don't see how that same ruling wouldn't apply to the Georgia case. And then I'd have to look at the Arizona case where he's not charged. He's an unindicted co-conspirator. But anywhere where he actually was facing charges, if the court rules there's immunity in Jack Smith's case, then that immunity should apply in those cases as well. The Florida case brought by the special counsel is in a different category because that involves conduct after Trump left office. So in a sense, that's the bookend to the earlier case that we were discussing that involved conduct before he took office as president. The Jack Smith case in Florida involving the classified documents involves conduct after he left office. So I don't think a ruling from the court, even if it comes out in Trump's favor to a certain extent on immunity regarding today's argument, would help him in the Florida case, other than providing a basis for him to assert in a new motion that it does that the court would have to rule upon. So it would provide delay, but substantively on the merits, it should not affect that case.
I want to ask you, Jessica, about what we heard today from Justice Alito as part of the immunity arguments. He supported Donald Trump's argument here, saying that it could be destabilizing if presidents are worried all the time that they'll be criminally prosecuted the minute they step out the door. We have to remind ourselves this is something that's going to apply to all presidents. He said that he questioned whether presidents will now fear they'll be criminally prosecuted by a bitter political opponent rather than going into a peaceful retirement, suggesting they may never leave the White House. If the court rules in Donald Trump's favor, what would keep Joe Biden from just staying in the Oval Office?
There were a number of fascinating moments in the argument today where some of the justices raised issues that hadn't been briefed, but that they said were relevant to their determination of the issues presented here. And for example, I think it was Justice Gorsuch who first raised the question of, well, could a president pardon himself for all potential crimes committed while in office on his way out the door so that he wouldn't have to fear prosecution once he left from political opponents? And Justice Alito picked up on that and said, yes, I think we need to know the answer to that question before we rule here on whether there's immunity. So there were these specters of incentives and, sort of this parade of horribles of things that presidents might engage in if they feared they might be prosecuted. And the answer that the lawyer for the Department of Justice and the Special Counsel's Office gave was essentially, we've just relied on public servants acting in good faith, that they wouldn't do these things out of concern about potentially being criminally prosecuted unfairly. And the status quo has been that there's been no immunity from criminal prosecution, and presidents have somehow managed to fulfill their duties without being unduly chilled and without trying to hold on to office once they had lost the next election. And so there was a fascinating sort of clash of worldviews. One that was articulated that was essentially sort of dystopian about presidents holding on to power and pardoning themselves in advance. And another worldview that said we've managed without anybody worrying too much about being politically prosecuted when they leave office. And so it was this clash of worldviews that was among the more fascinating parts of the argument.
Boy. We live in interesting times, Jessica, helping us navigate uncharted waters. Jessica Roth, it's great to have you back today on Bloomberg. Coming up, we'll continue our coverage of the hearing on presidential immunity before the Supreme Court with our political panel. It's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The U.S. Supreme Court had a monumental hearing on immunity, and the immunity having to do with presidential immunity. And I think it was made clear, I hope it was made clear, that a president has to have immunity, and you don't have a president, or at most you can say it would be a ceremonial president. That's not what the founders had in mind.
Former President Trump, after court concluded for the day in New York today, reflecting on what happened down the Amtrak corridor at the Supreme Court. Simultaneously, the arguments held, as we were discussing earlier, in Donald Trump's presidential immunity case. Joining us now, our political panel. Alvin Jordan of Rock Solutions is with us, along with Maura Gillespie, founder principal at Blue Stack Strategies. It's great to see both of you here. Really remarkable day in the court, and I don't want to try to turn either of you into legal analysts. We want to know what the political implications are of what we heard today. Because, Alvin, I'll start with you. It appears that the court may be on the precipice of taking a couple of arguments away from Joe Biden on the campaign trail. You can see that vindicated Truth Social post already. If there's any nuance, if there's any sunlight between the court and the government on this.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I look at it is any, kind of amount of time that is given back to the former president is a win. And so I think if you're the Biden administration, you have to look at this and feel, like you've, lost a little ground in the sense that, any delay or any pushing it back to the courts, really buys enough time for Trump to continue to at least think about what his next move might be. And so I think, in that way, you have to look at it as definitely a step back as far as, like you said, building those arguments if you're, part of the Biden camp for sure.
Well, so it remains a question as to whether or not Trump is ever going to see a trial in Jack Smith's case. He very well could not if ultimately it doesn't go before the election. He is elected president again and has the ability to pardon himself for a federal case like this. He is, though, Maura, in court in New York for a trial that is ongoing. A lot of people consider these to be lesser charges, if you will, or not have the same kind of gravity as the ones related to January 6th. But if he were to be convicted in New York a couple weeks from now, which is a real possibility, how is that going to change things for him politically? Does that still fuel the fire of the base, or does it call into question enough of those independents' willingness to vote for him that actually it is something much more serious?
It doesn't change his base. Their support for him is unwavering. We have seen that. He has time and again showed us, and they've proved it. For those who are, and when we say independents, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're in the middle. Like, they just don't know who to vote for. They're lost. They don't know who they really are going to choose, and they may very well do write-ins. I think that's something that people need to consider as well. We saw that in Pennsylvania. A ton of people still voted for Nikki Haley.
17%.
Yeah. So in looking at the Trump voters and how this will impact them, it won't impact his team, his supporters. But for those voters who are watching him be convicted, who have watched this play out and are frustrated, they're not going to see this as an opportunity to vote for him, despite how they feel about Joe Biden, despite the fact they don't want Joe Biden to be president again. They're not going to vote for Donald Trump.
Well, it's interesting, Alvin. The strategy so far has been just give him rope. Joe Biden's not talking about this case openly, the New York criminal trial. But if we know we're not going to see Jack Smith bring him into court here in Washington, if we're in a world in which there is no January 6th trial, do we need to start reevaluating that strategy, start calling him out? Would that be a good move for Joe Biden over the summer?
I mean, on the one hand, sure. On the other, it is a bit of, I think, wasted time because, as we just laid out, the base is the base. And I think, there needs to be kind of a conservative effort put forth to try to sway or fix or bring those arguments kind of closer to what are those undecideds, because those are really where I feel like the advantage is for President Biden as opposed to, kind of attacking and targeting, President Trump in that way, because the base, that base isn't going anywhere. I mean, like you say, they've proven it time and time again. And so I think kind of playing to those undecideds and those people that are still in the middle are probably where, the president's efforts should probably be focused in that way.
Certainly a lot of time has been spent on programs like this one, analyzing comments from Donald Trump that can be seen potentially as dog whistles to that base to which we're referring. Speaking outside court this afternoon, Donald Trump was talking about the pro-Palestinian protests that we're seeing on campuses, including in New York, like at Columbia University, compared them to Charlottesville, where there was white supremacists. It ultimately led to a death of a woman. He said there were good people on both sides. He says Charlottesville was a little peanut, and it was nothing compared to the kind of hate we're seeing here. Maybe that does do things for his base, Maura, but what does that kind of rhetoric do for him with everyone else?
I don't think that one should compare the two. I don't think you should belittle what happened in Charlottesville in that way. So I think, again, talking to those undecided voters, they will once again see Donald Trump making flippant comments to try and defend himself for things that were indefensible. So, an educated voter is not going to see that as a play to get their vote. He's only playing to his base. And so the point here is that those undecided voters are what's going to make or break the 24 election. That really is what's at stake here. And candidates should be trying to get those voters onto their side. I do think that you're going to see more write-ins because it's not the responsibility of us as voters to pick one or the other. It is the responsibility of the candidates to get our vote. And that is not how you get the vote of those who are Nikki Haley voters or those who are contemplating Joe Biden. That's not going to appeal to them.
Yeah. All right, well, we're going to spend some time talking about Joe Biden coming up, as he also is in New York today. He's fundraising, not in court. We'll be back with our political panel, Maura Gillespie and Alvin Jordan, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's clear we have the strongest economy in the world, and that's a fact. 15 million new jobs created in 3.5 years. Unemployment hasn't been this low for this long for 50 years. Wages are rising. Instead of importing foreign products, we're exporting American jobs. We're exporting American products and creating American jobs.
President Biden earlier today in Syracuse unveiling $13.6 billion in semiconductor investments. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew, joined by our political panel, Alvin Jordan of Rock Solutions and Maura Gillespie, founder and principal at Blue Stack Strategies. So, Alvin, you heard the president there talking about the economy, how it's strong, everything he's done on a day where we got softer growth data, higher inflation data. Is there a point in which he should no longer be trying to lean in to the economy narrative and instead just focus on other issues?
Yeah, today. I think the voters have made it loud and clear. It's like, we hear you, from an infrastructure standpoint, from these broader kind of big box numbers, but we're not feeling it. We're not feeling it as we go to the grocery store. We're not feeling it, kind of as we, go to the gas pump, that type of thing. And so I think there has to be some other arguments where he starts to kind of, pull the base a bit closer, but also kind of bring in some of those people who are undecided and trying to figure out where where they'll cast their vote. And I just think that kind of talking, this is not something that I think is landing in a way that, he would want it to be as, kind of stated as he rolls it out as a major talking point.
So the economy is a cudgel for Republicans here. It's almost as if the economy to Republicans is what abortion is to Democrats. Which one rises to the top?
They're both going to be important, especially when you're talking about those undecided voters. But I think what the president should be doing to try and win them over is talking about what voters can expect coming in the future. Yeah. Start getting into the tangible things that are actually going to matter to families at home. Housing prices, they need to talk more about that. And then again, hit on the abortion stuff. Talk about women's reproductive rights, because that's going to draw in those undecideds. Republicans have long struggled. And again, speaking as a Republican, we have long struggled to talk about that issue. And it's certainly not going well for us when you have situations like what's happening in Arizona and Florida coming up. So. Yeah.
Just quickly here, Alvin, we have about a minute left. We do have Biden in New York fundraising today. He has shown a lot of prowess in that aspect. Is that going to be enough to counteract his weakness in the polls ultimately, or does money not matter in a race like this one?
Well, money clearly matters, as we see the former president trying to scrape together everything that he can to continue.
He's got legal bills to pay.
Exactly. So, money does matter in the grand scheme of things. But I think that, obviously raising money is important. Let us not, act like it's not. But what really is important is kind of hitting on these issues and I think running the playbook to actually talk about some of these things like reproductive rights that, we've talked about here today. And I think the quicker that he can get to those, the better it'll be.
Just wait for Joe Biden's event with George Clooney, right?
Mm-hmm.
Julia
Hollywood.
Roberts. There's a lot of money
right.
yet to be raised. Maura Gillespie, Alvin Jordan, great conversation. We thank you for being with us. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
We'll see you back here tomorrow. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.